The other thing we need to talk about in this module is something called a growing perpetuity. Notice in this diagram that each cash flow has a different subscript to denote which year it occurs: C1, C2, C3, etc. If those cash flows are completely different, then there is no practical way of calculating the present value. The only way that we can calculate the present value of a perpetuity where the cash flows are different from each other is if they are growing at a constant rate. So that means that C2 is equal to C1 times 1 plus G, where G is the growth rate. C3 is equal to C2 times 1 plus G, where C2 is growing at the same growth rate, and so on. Another way to calculate C3 would be to take C1 and multiply by 1 plus G squared, and so on. The formula for the present value of a growing perpetuity is this: the first cash flow, C1, divided by R minus G. Once again, we note that the first cash flow occurs at the end of the first period, so C1 occurs one period in the future. R is the interest rate per period, G is the growth rate, and it's important to note that R must be greater than G. If R is equal to G, then we're dividing something by 0, and that's not possible. And if the growth rate is greater than the discount rate, if the cash flows are growing at a greater rate than the rate at which we are discounting them to a present value, then the present value would be infinite. Sometimes we don't actually know what C1 is. In some situations, we are given other information and we need to work out what C1 is. The most common example is a share, where the dividend is growing at a constant rate, and we know the most recent dividend, which we can call C0. C0 is not part of the future cash flows and doesn't actually get included in the present value, but we can use C0 to calculate C1. As you can see, there are effectively two versions of this formula. The first one is the one that we've already looked at. The present value of a growing perpetuity is C1 over R minus G. If we are given C0, we need to use that information to calculate C1. So the numerator of this formula becomes C0 times 1 plus G.